I was sitting at my desk in the open plan office on a Wednesday morning when my manager Nathan walked up with 2 security guards and told me to pack my things because I was being terminated, effective immediately, for being a bottleneck to the team's productivity. Just like that. No private conversation. No warning, no chance to defend myself. He said it loud enough that everyone in our section could hear. And the room went quiet except for the sound of keyboards stopping mid-sentence. I looked up at Nathan, confused, because I'd been working 60-hour weeks for the past 3 months trying to keep up with impossible deadlines he kept adding. I'd missed my nephew's birthday party last weekend because Nathan needed those reports finished by Monday. I'd eaten dinner at my desk every night this week, and now I was being fired for being slow. The security guard stood there waiting while Nathan crossed his arms and told me I had 10 minutes to clear out my personal belongings, that IT would escort me out, and that my access badge would be deactivated at the door. My coworkers stared at their screens, pretending not to watch, but I could feel their eyes on me. 3 years at this company, 3 years of consistent performance reviews, 3 years of being told I was valuable, and it ended with public humiliation and armed escorts. I started putting my coffee mug and picture frames into my bag with shaking hands, my face burning hot with shame and confusion. My name is Jordan Wells, and I was 31 years old, a senior data analyst at Vertex Analytics, a mid-sized tech company that specialized in predictive modeling for retail clients. I'd been hired right out of graduate school and worked my way up from junior analyst to team lead over 3 years of dedicated service. I'd built the forecasting models that landed our biggest client account last year, trained 4 new analysts, and consistently hit my performance targets. And now I was being fired in front of 40 people like I was some kind of criminal. Nathan stood there watching me pack, making sure I didn't take anything that belonged to the company. And I wanted to ask him what I'd done wrong, what specific bottleneck he was talking about. But my throat was too tight to speak. I grabbed my notebook, my pens, my emergency snacks from my drawer, trying to maintain some dignity while everyone pretended to work. My best friend at the company, Kayla, looked up from her desk with shock written all over her face, and I shook my head slightly to tell her not to say anything. Not to make this worse. The security guards shifted impatiently, and Nathan tapped his watch like I was wasting his valuable time. I picked up the small succulent plant my team had given me for my birthday and dropped it into my bag, dirt spilling onto the desk, my hands trembling too much to be careful. Nathan started explaining to the gathered crowd, like this was some kind of teaching moment, that the decision had been made at the management level after careful review of team performance metrics. He said my work had been creating delays across multiple projects, that other team members had been forced to cover my inadequacies, and that despite coaching and feedback, there'd been no improvement. I stared at him because none of that was true. I'd never received coaching or negative feedback. My last performance review 6 weeks ago had been rated exceeds expectations with a 4% raise. But Nathan was building his narrative in real time, and I could see other managers nodding along from their offices like they'd known this was coming. My coworker Brandon actually looked relieved, like he'd been waiting for this. I realized they'd all been part of some conversation I wasn't included in. Some decision made in closed-door meetings where my work had been discussed and judged without my knowledge. Nathan said the company needed to move faster, be more agile, and sometimes that meant making difficult personnel decisions. He made it sound reasonable, necessary, even compassionate, like firing me publicly was somehow for my own good. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to demand specifics about these alleged bottlenecks, but the security guards were already picking up my box of belongings, ready to escort me out. I was given 60 seconds to say goodbye to nobody, because nobody was making eye contact anymore. Within an hour, I learned through text messages from Kayla that Nathan had sent a company-wide email explaining my termination as a necessary restructuring decision and thanking everyone for their understanding during this transition period. The email apparently characterized me as someone who'd been struggling with workload management and hadn't been a good culture fit for the company's fast-paced environment. Kayla sent me screenshots, and I read words like performance concerns and team dynamics and mutual agreement, even though there'd been nothing mutual about it. By noon, 3 former coworkers had unfollowed me on LinkedIn. By the afternoon, someone had already updated the team directory, removing my name. It was like I'd been erased from 3 years of work, relationships, and contributions in a single morning. My professional reputation was being quietly rewritten as the person who couldn't keep up, who'd held everyone back, who'd deserved to be let go. And I had no platform to correct the story, because I wasn't there anymore. Kayla told me people were already redistributing my projects, and Nathan was positioning himself as the manager who'd made the tough call to protect team productivity. He was getting praised for decisive leadership, while I sat in my apartment wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. That evening, my mother called asking if I was okay, because someone had posted about workplace changes in our industry group, and she'd heard I'd left Vertex. Left. Like I'd chosen to go. Like it had been my decision. I tried calling Nathan's office the next day, asking for an explanation, asking for documentation of these performance issues he'd cited, asking for anything that would help me understand what had happened. His assistant said he was in meetings all day and would get back to me. He never did. I called HR and got transferred 3 times before reaching someone who told me that employment terminations were confidential matters, and they couldn't discuss specific details. But I should receive my final paycheck and benefits information within 2 weeks. I asked about the performance concerns Nathan had mentioned, and the HR representative said I should speak with my former manager about those, which was circular and useless. I asked if there was an appeals process, and she said terminations made at the management level were final unless there were legal concerns, and was I alleging something illegal? Her tone made it clear that questioning the decision would only make things worse. I asked for copies of my performance reviews, and she said she'd look into it but couldn't promise anything. Then she thanked me for my service to Vertex and wished me luck in my future endeavors, and the call ended. I sat there feeling powerless and confused, like I'd been pushed out of a moving vehicle and left on the side of the road. Something in me shifted from confusion to anger, from shame to determination. If they were going to destroy my reputation, I deserved to know why. That night, I pulled out every file I had on my laptop, every project, document I'd saved to my personal cloud storage for backup purposes, and started building a timeline. While organizing my files at 2 a.m., I found something that made my pulse quicken. Buried in my email archives were budget reports from the past 6 months, showing that Nathan had been systematically misallocating project hours. He'd been billing clients for work I'd completed but attributing those hours to other team members, specifically to Brandon and to himself. Entire projects I'd led were showing up in company records, with Nathan listed as primary analyst and me relegated to minor contributor. I'd thought it was just administrative error, the kind of thing that happens in busy departments. But, looking at the pattern across 15 different client accounts, I realized it was deliberate. Nathan had been stealing credit for my work while positioning himself for promotion. There were emails where I'd flagged discrepancies, politely asking Nathan to correct the billing records, and he'd responded saying he'd handle it, but never did. There were timesheets I'd submitted, showing 60-hour weeks that had been edited down to 40 hours in the final reports, making it look like I was barely meeting minimum requirements, while Nathan appeared to be carrying the team. I'd been too busy working to notice the systematic way he'd been erasing my contributions and inflating his own value. The narrative he'd built about me being a bottleneck suddenly made sense. He'd needed to remove me before anyone noticed the discrepancies between reality and the records he'd created. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Nathan's boss, the VP of Analytics, a man named Warren, who I'd worked with directly on 2 major client presentations. His assistant said Warren was traveling but might have time next week. I said it was urgent regarding my termination and documentation irregularities, and suddenly Warren had 20 minutes available that afternoon. I walked into Vertex's lobby, like a visitor instead of an employee, signed in at the front desk, and waited in the glass-walled conference room where Warren met me, looking uncomfortable. I laid out my findings carefully, showing him the billing discrepancies, the misattributed hours, the edited timesheets. Warren looked through the documents with an increasingly tight expression, and then he said something that made my stomach drop. Nathan had submitted a performance improvement plan for me 3 months ago, citing chronic delays and quality issues, a plan I'd never seen or been asked to sign. Warren showed me the document on his tablet. It was dated, detailed, and completely fabricated. Nathan had created an entire paper trail of my supposed failures, documenting coaching sessions that never happened, and improvement goals I'd never been given. Warren asked why I hadn't responded to the PP, and I told him I'd never received it because it had never been sent to me. He frowned and said it was in the system showing as delivered and acknowledged, and I realized Nathan had forged my acknowledgement signature. This wasn't just credit theft anymore. This was fraud. Warren leaned back and said this was concerning, but he'd need time to investigate, to pull records, to verify the information I was presenting. He suggested I work through official channels, possibly consult with an employment attorney, and avoid making accusations I couldn't fully substantiate. I asked him directly whether he believed Nathan would fabricate documentation to justify firing someone whose work he'd been stealing. And Warren said he couldn't speculate about motivations without completing a thorough review. But his eyes told me he knew something wasn't right. He asked me to send him everything I had, and he'd bring it to the executive team. I asked how long that would take, and he said these things moved slowly, especially when they involved potential misconduct by management. He told me I should understand that even if irregularities were found, there was no guarantee of reinstatement, and these processes were complicated by legal and reputational concerns. Then he said something that changed everything. You should know that Nathan's being considered for director of analytics. This investigation could delay that promotion significantly. I realized Warren wasn't concerned about justice for me. He was concerned about the company's exposure if Nathan's fraud became public. I thanked him for his time, walked out of that building, and called the one person I'd been avoiding contacting because I didn't want to seem like I couldn't handle my own problems. My former professor, Dr. Whitmore, who was on Vertex's advisory board and had recommended me for my job 3 years ago. Dr. Whitmore listened to my story over coffee, asked pointed questions about the documentation, and then told me something I didn't know. Vertex had been founded 15 years ago by a tech entrepreneur named Blake Morrison, who'd stepped back from daily operations 5 years ago to focus on venture capital, but still maintained majority ownership and board authority. Most employees had never met Blake because he traveled constantly and rarely visited the office. But Dr. Whitmore said Blake had very specific values about integrity and merit-based advancement. She said if what I was describing was true, Blake would want to know, because this kind of management fraud undermined everything he'd built the company on. She asked if I was prepared for the fallout of going over everyone's heads to contact the founder. And I said I'd already lost my job and my reputation, so I didn't have much left to protect. She made a call right there at the coffee shop, and after a brief conversation, she handed me her phone. Blake's voice was younger than I'd expected, direct and curious, and he asked me to explain what happened in 2 minutes or less. I told him about the termination, the stolen credit, the forged PIP, the pattern of fraud. He asked 3 specific questions about dates, amounts, and witnesses. Then he said he'd be at the Vertex office tomorrow at 10 a.m. for an unannounced visit, and I should be there. I started to thank him, but he'd already hung up. That evening, Nathan sent me a casual text asking how I was doing and saying he'd heard I'd met with Warren, that he hoped there were no hard feelings about the termination, that these business decisions were never personal. The message was clearly designed to feel friendly while actually being a warning. He knew I was pushing back, and he was establishing plausible deniability. I didn't respond. Instead, I spent the night organizing every piece of evidence I had. The billing discrepancies, the email chains, the forged PIP, my actual performance reviews, client feedback praising my work, messages from coworkers, thanking me for covering their projects when Nathan had reassigned me at the last minute. I built a timeline showing that Nathan's documented concerns about my performance had started exactly when I'd begun questioning the billing irregularities, which proved his termination decision was retaliatory. I also found something else. An email thread from 8 months ago where Nathan had told our biggest client that he'd personally designed the forecasting model I'd actually built, taking full credit for work that had won Vertex a $2 million contract. He hadn't just stolen credit internally, he'd lied to clients. At midnight, I received another text from Nathan. This one more direct. Heard you're making waves. Might want to think about future references before burning bridges. I screenshot the message, added it to my evidence folder, and smiled. He was scared, which meant he knew exactly what he'd done. I arrived at Vertex at 9:45 a.m., and the receptionist looked confused when I asked to wait in the lobby because I wasn't in the system anymore. She made a call, looked even more confused, and told me someone would be down shortly. At exactly 10 a.m., the elevator opened, and a man in dark jeans and an untucked button-down walked out, looking around the lobby like he was trying to remember the layout. He walked straight to the receptionist and said, "Blake Morrison here to see Warren Phillips." And her face went pale. She stammered that she'd notify Mr. Phillips immediately, and Blake said not to bother, he'd find his way. Then he turned to me and asked if I was Jordan, and when I nodded, he said, "Walk with me." We went straight to the 4th floor where the analytics department was located, and I could see through the glass walls that Nathan was in the middle of a team meeting, gesturing at a presentation screen while my former coworkers took notes. Blake walked in without knocking, and the room went completely silent. Nathan's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and fear in about 3 seconds. Blake introduced himself to the room, said he was there for a routine check-in, and asked if he could borrow Nathan for a few minutes. Nathan stood up too quickly, knocking over his coffee, and followed Blake to the conference room, looking back at me with an expression that said he'd just realized how badly he'd miscalculated. Blake asked me to join them in the conference room along with Warren, who'd appeared from somewhere looking flustered and unprepared. Blake sat at the head of the table and told Nathan he'd received concerning information about personnel decisions in the analytics department and wanted to hear Nathan's perspective before reviewing documentation. Nathan started explaining that my termination had been necessary due to performance issues, that the team had been struggling with delays, that the decision had been made after extensive coaching and feedback. Blake asked to see the documentation of this coaching, and Nathan pulled up the forged PIP on his laptop showing the dates and improvement goals. Blake asked me if I'd ever seen this document before, and I said no, never, and that the signature acknowledging receipt wasn't mine. Nathan's face flushed, and he insisted the document had been properly delivered and processed through HR. Blake asked Warren to pull up the original file with metadata showing when it was created, who created it, and when it was electronically signed. Warren fumbled with his laptop while Nathan started talking faster, explaining that sometimes employees don't remember receiving documents when they're stressed or struggling, that it wasn't unusual for performance plans to be disputed. Blake waited silently while Warren pulled up the file properties, and when Warren read the metadata aloud, his voice got quiet. The document had been created 1 week ago, 2 months after the date it claimed to have been issued, and 1 day before my termination. The signature had been added digitally, using Nathan's user credentials, not mine. The room temperature seemed to drop as Blake asked Nathan to explain why he'd created a backdated performance improvement plan and forged an employee's acknowledgement. Nathan stammered that there must be some technical error, that the metadata was wrong, that IT sometimes had glitches. Blake pulled out his phone and called someone, putting it on speaker, and asked them to pull all documentation related to my personnel file, including access logs showing who'd created, edited, or viewed documents in the past 6 months. While we waited, Blake asked me to present my evidence, and I pulled up my laptop showing the billing discrepancies where Nathan had systematically misattributed my work hours to himself and others. I showed client invoices, listing Nathan as primary analyst on projects I'd led, timesheets that had been edited to reduce my recorded hours, and email exchanges where I'd flagged these discrepancies and been told they'd be corrected. Blake's expression never changed, but Warren looked sick. Then I showed the email where Nathan had taken credit for my forecasting model to our biggest client, explicitly lying about who designed the system that won them a $2 million contract. Blake asked Nathan if he'd designed that model, and Nathan said he'd supervised the project, which technically gave him ownership of the deliverables. I pulled up my original design documents with timestamps and version history, proving I'd created the entire system before Nathan was even assigned to that client account. Blake nodded slowly and asked if there was more, and I showed him 12 more instances of the same pattern across different projects and clients. Blake asked Nathan one direct question. Did you terminate Jordan to cover up the fact that you'd been stealing credit for her work? Nathan's silence was deafening. He looked at Warren like he expected help, but Warren was staring at his laptop screen, probably calculating his own liability. Finally, Nathan said he'd made difficult management decisions based on team performance needs, that his attribution of work hours had been approximate and within normal management discretion, that I was clearly bitter about being fired and was reframing normal workplace practices as misconduct. Blake asked him to explain why he'd created a backdated PIP with a forged signature if his termination decision had been legitimate. Nathan said he'd needed documentation to support the termination and had compiled it after the fact, which wasn't ideal but wasn't illegal. Blake leaned forward and said actually, forging employee signatures on HR documents was fraud. Misrepresenting work attribution on client billables was contract fraud, and terminating an employee for questioning billing irregularities was retaliation. Then Blake said the word that made everything real. You're fired, Nathan. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out, and legal will be in contact regarding the company's investigation into your conduct. Nathan's face went white, then red, and he started arguing that Blake couldn't do this, that he had contracts, that there were procedures, that his work for the company was exemplary. Blake stood up and said, I just did it. You have 10 minutes to collect your personal items. Then he walked out, leaving Nathan sitting there in shock while Warren quietly called security. I walked out of that conference room and stood in the hallway while Nathan was escorted to his desk by the same security guards who'd removed me a week earlier. The entire analytics floor watched through glass walls as their manager packed his belongings in a cardboard box, his face burning with humiliation. My former coworkers looked between Nathan and me, clearly trying to piece together what had just happened. Kayla caught my eye and mouthed, "Oh my God," and I gave her a small shrug like I was just as surprised as everyone else. Blake found me in the hallway and asked if I had a few minutes to talk in Warren's office. Inside, Warren sat behind his desk looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past hour, and Blake stood by the window looking out at the city. Blake said the company owed me a formal apology, reinstatement with back pay if I wanted it, and compensation for the reputational damage Nathan had caused. He said they'd be conducting a full audit of Nathan's work attribution across all client accounts and correcting the record. Warren added that they'd also be reviewing their HR processes to prevent this kind of fraud from happening again. Blake asked what I wanted, and I said I needed time to think, that 24 hours ago I'd been unemployed and humiliated, and now I was being offered my job back, and it was a lot to process. Blake nodded and said that was fair, but I should know that he didn't tolerate people like Nathan in his companies, and anyone who'd contributed to or enabled this situation would be held accountable. Blake left, and Warren tried to explain that he hadn't known about the forged documents, that Nathan had been a trusted manager with a strong track record, that the company had relied on his judgment. I asked Warren if he'd noticed that all my major projects had stopped being attributed to me 6 months ago, and he admitted he'd thought I'd been transitioning to more administrative work. I asked if he'd found it strange that my performance had supposedly declined, right when Nathan was being considered for promotion, and he said in retrospect there were red flags he should have caught. He offered me Nathan's position, Director of Analytics, with a 30% salary increase and direct authority over the team. I asked if he was offering me the promotion because I deserved it or because the company was trying to avoid a lawsuit, and he had the decency to look uncomfortable before admitting it was both. I told him I'd think about it and left. Walking through the office, I could feel everyone watching me, whispers spreading about what had happened, the narrative shifting in real time from Jordan couldn't handle the job to Jordan exposed Nathan's fraud. Brandon, who'd looked so relieved at my termination, now wouldn't make eye contact. The team members who'd unfollowed me on LinkedIn were suddenly sending connection requests. My work wife Kayla grabbed my arm and asked if I was okay, if this was real, if I was coming back. I told her I didn't know yet, and she said everyone had known something was wrong, but nobody had the courage to speak up, and she was sorry. That apology meant more than Warren's job offer. That evening, I received a call from Blake asking if I'd meet him for dinner to discuss not just my position at Vertex, but a broader opportunity he was considering. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, and he got straight to the point. He'd been looking for someone to help him audit leadership across his portfolio companies, someone who understood both analytics and organizational dysfunction, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by executives. He said what I'd done, methodically documenting fraud, going through proper channels, and standing up for myself when those channels failed, was exactly the kind of integrity he needed in his organization. He offered me a position as special advisor, reporting directly to him, working across multiple companies to identify operational issues and leadership problems before they became catastrophic. The salary was double what I'd been making at Vertex. The work would be challenging and sometimes uncomfortable because I'd be the person asking difficult questions that executives didn't want to answer. I asked why he trusted me after one interaction, and he said he'd spent the afternoon reviewing every project I'd ever worked on at Vertex, reading client feedback, talking to my former coworkers, and checking my academic record. He said the evidence was clear. I was exceptionally good at my job, and Nathan had been threatened by that competence. Blake said he didn't want me to decide immediately, but he wanted me to consider whether fighting for one job at one company was enough, or whether I wanted to help him build something bigger. The next day, Warren called asking if I'd made a decision about the director position. I told him I was considering other opportunities, and he said he understood, but hoped I'd think about the team I'd be leaving behind, the relationships I'd built, the impact I could have. It felt manipulative, using my loyalty against me when the company had shown zero loyalty to me. I asked him what would happen to the people who'd enabled Nathan's behavior, the HR staff who'd processed forged documents, the managers who'd nodded along when I was publicly fired. Warren said personnel decisions were confidential, but the company was taking the matter seriously. I asked for specifics, and he gave me corporate speak about reviews and accountability measures. I realized they were hoping I'd come back quietly, accept the promotion, and let them handle everything internally without external scrutiny. That evening, I received an email from the company's legal department with a settlement offer. Reinstatement as Director of Analytics, $50,000 compensation for damages, correction of all personnel records, and a mutual non-disparagement agreement preventing me from discussing Nathan's conduct publicly or with other employees. The non-disparagement clause would silence me about everything that happened, protecting the company's reputation while ensuring Nathan's fraud stayed buried. I forwarded the offer to Blake, and he called me immediately, saying if I signed that agreement, I couldn't work for him, because his companies needed people who could speak truth, not people who'd been legally muzzled. The choice was suddenly clear. I declined Vertex's settlement offer and accepted Blake's position. Warren called me personally, surprised and frustrated, asking why I'd turned down a director role for uncertainty with a startup-focused advisor position. I told him I was choosing integrity over convenience, and his silence told me he understood exactly what I meant. 2 days later, Vertex announced organizational changes. Warren was stepping down as VP to pursue other opportunities. Nathan had been terminated for policy violations, and the analytics department would be restructured under new leadership. The announcement was carefully worded to avoid admitting fraud, while still making it clear something serious had happened. My phone started ringing with former coworkers asking what really happened, whether the rumors about forged documents were true, whether Nathan had actually been stealing credit. I told them I couldn't comment on personnel matters but suggested they review their own project attributions carefully. Within a week, 3 other analysts found similar discrepancies in how Nathan had billed their work, and 2 of them filed formal complaints with HR. The company's carefully controlled narrative started unraveling as more people came forward with their own stories of Nathan's manipulation. By the end of the month, Vertex was facing a potential class action lawsuit from employees whose work had been misattributed. And the company's reputation in our industry was seriously damaged. Blake invited me to present my findings to his board, explaining how Nathan's fraud had functioned and what systemic failures had allowed it to continue for months. I walked them through the evidence methodically. The pattern of misattribution, the forged documentation, the retaliatory termination, the HR failures that had processed obviously fraudulent documents without verification. I showed them how Nathan had exploited gaps in oversight, how he'd leveraged his position to control narratives, and how the company's emphasis on manager autonomy had created opportunities for abuse. The board members asked tough questions about whether this was an isolated incident or indicative of broader cultural problems at Vertex. I told them honestly that I'd only worked in one department, but the fact that multiple managers had watched me get publicly fired and said nothing suggested a culture where self-preservation trumped speaking up. One board member asked what I would do differently if I were restructuring the department, and I laid out specific recommendations: independent verification of project attribution, anonymous reporting channels, regular audits of billing accuracy, and protection for employees who flag irregularities. Blake nodded and said this was exactly the kind of analytical thinking he needed. After the presentation, he told me my first assignment would be conducting similar audits across 3 of his portfolio companies, looking for leadership dysfunction before it became crisis. 3 months later, I was working across Blake's portfolio when I received a LinkedIn message from Warren. He said he'd taken time to reflect on what happened at Vertex, that he'd realized he'd been complicit in Nathan's behavior by not asking harder questions, by trusting the wrong person, by prioritizing smooth operations over actual integrity. He said he'd failed me as a leader, and he was genuinely sorry. He'd taken a position with a smaller company where he was trying to build the kind of transparent culture he should have maintained at Vertex. His apology felt genuine, and I appreciated it. But it also came too late to change what had happened. I thanked him for reaching out and told him I hoped he'd learned from the experience. He asked if I'd ever consider working with him again in the future, and I told him honestly that trust was earned through consistent action over time, not through a single apology. The message I really wanted to send was to Nathan, but I didn't need to, because the industry handled it. His name was quietly circulated among analytics professionals as someone who'd committed billing fraud, and he couldn't get hired anywhere reputable. His LinkedIn profile eventually disappeared entirely, and the last I heard, he'd left the industry. I didn't celebrate his downfall, because his fraud had damaged my reputation too, and rebuilding that took time and consistent proof that I was actually as good as my work showed. The legal resolution with Vertex took 6 months. The company settled with me for $150,000 in damages without the non-disparagement agreement, corrected all my personnel records, and issued a formal letter of recommendation acknowledging my contributions. They also implemented new oversight policies for project attribution and created an independent ethics reporting channel. It wasn't revenge, it was accountability. The company had to publicly acknowledge what happened, correct the systems that had failed, and compensate me appropriately. I didn't gloat or try to destroy anyone else's career. I just insisted on truth and appropriate consequences. What surprised me was how many other companies in Blake's portfolio had similar issues lurking under the surface. In my first year, I identified 3 other executives who were engaging in various forms of credit theft, retaliation, or fraud. Each situation was different, but the pattern was the same. Someone in power exploiting structural weaknesses to benefit themselves while harming others. Blake's reputation for zero tolerance spread quickly, and his companies became known as places where merit actually mattered and political manipulation didn't work. I became known as the person who asked uncomfortable questions and wouldn't accept convenient lies, which made some executives nervous, but earned respect from people who wanted to work in honest environments. A year after my termination, I was invited back to Vertex to speak at their leadership retreat about organizational integrity and the cost of tolerating toxic management. Walking into that building as a guest speaker instead of a fired employee felt surreal. The new VP of Analytics, a woman named Amber, who'd been promoted from another department, introduced me and acknowledged that the company had failed me, but was committed to learning from that failure. I talked about the warning signs they'd missed, the courage it took to speak up when you knew it might cost you everything, and the importance of creating cultures where truth-telling was rewarded instead of punished. After my presentation, several employees approached me privately to say they'd been in the room when I was fired, that they'd felt sick watching it happen, and that they were ashamed they hadn't spoken up. I told them I understood that speaking up was risky, but silence had costs too. Costs to people like me who'd relied on colleagues to witness and validate what was happening. One analyst told me she'd found similar attribution issues in her own work after my case went public, and she'd been able to correct them because I'd shown it was possible to challenge management fraud. That conversation meant more to me than any settlement check, because it proved the pain hadn't been pointless. Blake asked me recently what I'd learned from the whole experience, and I told him I'd learned that betrayal wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it was quiet and bureaucratic, disguised as management decisions and process optimization. Nathan hadn't destroyed my work in a dramatic confrontation. He'd systematically erased me from records and narratives until my contributions disappeared. Fighting back had required documentation, patience, and the willingness to be called bitter or difficult. It had required believing in my own value when everyone else was telling me I was the problem. Blake said that kind of resilience was exactly what his companies needed. People who wouldn't accept false narratives just because they were convenient or widely believed. He told me he'd founded his company on the principle that good work should speak for itself. But he'd been naive about how easily that work could be stolen or obscured by people with the right access and wrong intentions. He said I'd reminded him why oversight mattered, why founders couldn't delegate integrity and assume it would persist, why the most important work was often protecting people who did excellent work from people who wanted credit without effort. That conversation happened in his office overlooking the city, and I realized I was sitting in the kind of position I'd never imagined back when I was packing my desk in shame. Now I run Blake's organizational integrity division across 12 companies, and my job is to identify and eliminate the kind of dysfunction that almost destroyed my career. I've helped remove toxic executives, restructure broken departments, and build systems that reward actual merit instead of political skill. I make good money, work with smart people, and sleep well knowing I'm using my experience to prevent others from suffering what I went through. Nathan's public firing didn't give me back the 3 months I spent unemployed and humiliated, but it did give me something more valuable. Proof that standing up for yourself can work, that documentation matters, that speaking truth to power isn't always career suicide. The company that fired me had to publicly acknowledge their mistake, pay for the damage, and rebuild their reputation. Nathan lost everything: his job, his reputation, his career in the industry. But I gained clarity about who I was and what I wouldn't tolerate, and that clarity became the foundation for everything I've built since. Family betrayal might hurt more than any enemy, but workplace betrayal teaches you something equally important. Your value isn't determined by people who need to diminish you to feel bigger. And if there's one thing I'd tell anyone facing similar treatment, it's this: document everything, trust your instincts, and never let someone else's fraud become your shame. Because getting terminated in front of everyone can be the beginning of something better, but only if you refuse to accept their version of who you are.